night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. Opened the earth, walking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts.
Greetings and good afternoon. On December 8th, the then president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, fled the country for the security and asylum of Moscow. He was run out of Syria by the U.S. proxy Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly the al-Qaeda franchise in Syria. Is Syria now a better country? Is the region more secure? Did the U.S. leave yet another power vacuum in its wake? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they take place, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is Syria and the Middle East. Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, now known as Ahmed al-Sharaa, has changed his name and been able to shed the $10 million CIA-sponsored bounty that was on his head to become Syria's de facto leader. What's going on in Syria today, post al-Assad? Let's talk with my guest. He has taught international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law since 2012. He's the author of a number of books, the latest of which is The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. And he has just returned from Syria. Professor Dan Kovalik. As always, Dan, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, Wilmer. It's always a pleasure.
And Open Doors has a piece wherein they write, after nearly 54 years of rule by the Assad family, first under Hafez al-Assad and later continued by his son Bashar al-Assad, a new era has emerged in Syria. Your thoughts, your thoughts on the latest developments in Syria?
Yeah, I think that in my own view, this is a tragedy, honestly, for Syria. People might be surprised to hear that, but Syria no longer exists as a unified state. I think it will not exist as such. So why is that the case? Well, so first of all, this HTS group that has taken over, which, as you mentioned, was an Al Qaeda offshoot, and Jelani, the self-proclaimed president, and I'm going to call him Jelani. I know he goes by a few different names. Jelani is his nom de guerre when he was the head of the Al Qaeda there in Syria. So I want to remind people of that. Since first of all, they are a creature and a puppet of the West. Tulsi Gabbard actually referred to this last week in her confirmation hearing. In fact, she was grilled about this. Oh, isn't it a Putin talking point that, Obama supported Al Qaeda and ISIS in Syria? This was supposed to be, something to undermine Tulsi, but she didn't shy away from it. She said, well, of course that's the case. Whether it's a Putin talking point or not, one of Putin's talking points is also that the world is round. It doesn't make the world flat. And anyway, she mentioned this Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the most expensive CIA regime change program ever. The CIA spent about $1 billion a year over, I believe, a 15-year period to topple the government of Assad. This combined with brutal economic sanctions, which denied the country basic goods and services, food, medicine, electricity, combined with the U.S. long-term occupation of a third of Syria, its most oil and grain-rich one-third of the country. All this combined to destabilize Syria and to pave the way for this HTS, which, again, was part of the CIA's regime change plan to support that group and others to topple Assad. All this paved the way for HTS to take over, which they have. Now, in the process of that takeover, Israel invaded from the south, has taken over huge parts of the south of Syria, including Mount Hermon, the tallest peak in all of the Levant, meaning Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And Israel's actually building a base in the south of Syria. Turkey, meanwhile, is building a base in the north of Syria. And the U.S. continues to occupy that one-third of in northeastern Syria. ISIS, meanwhile, which is no longer allied with the HTS Al-Qaeda, has taken over the ancient town of Palmyra. So you can see it's being balkanized, this country. So that alone means this is not good for the Syrian people. But in addition to that, this HTS group, this Al-Qaeda group, represents an extreme form of Sunni Islam known as Wahhabism, which is very hostile towards other forms of Islam like Shia Islam, Alawite Islam, Christianity, all those being, groups represented in Syria and have been for a long time. So now, in addition to the things I mentioned, the new government forces are engaged in massacres of different ethnic groups, particularly the Alawites in the city of Homs. And already according to the UN, about 600,000 people have fled Syria since HTS took power. And a large number of these are Shia, Christians, Alawites. And it's interesting because at first, the government in Damascus, again represented by Jelani, was like, yeah, we know these killings are happening, and that's a bad thing, but we have no control over it. But now Jelani, I don't know if you saw this, Wilmer, but the Cradle had a piece saying Jelani has privately stated that he knows these killings are happening. It's a natural thing these things are happening, and they're going to happen for the next 2 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So now they're taking ownership of this. Meanwhile, Jelani's also saying there's not going to be elections for years, possibly even 4 years. So, the killings are going to continue for a few years, while the path is laid for elections to happen where the HTS will be the only group standing. Meanwhile, opposition parties have been outlawed. So this is not a good thing.
So this is a real democracy we're talking. This is the United States bringing democracy back to Syria.
Yeah. Well, that's what they claim. And of course, all of a sudden, Al-Qaeda, who, we've been taught are the bad guys, right? Are the ones that flew the planes into the World Trade Center on 9/11. Now they're the good guys. I mean, this is 1984 stuff. George Orwell could not write this script better, okay? In fact, he would not have anything to write about because truth is stranger than fiction in this case. And yet we're all supposed to just accept this. And again, we're all supposed to jump on the anti-Tulsi Gabbard, bandwagon for her just pointing out the obvious. The U.S. is recognizing this new government. They're happy with this new government. So why are we surprised that they had supported these people all along? And one should go back. I go back to this article a lot, and I refer your audience to an article back in 2007. This is before the war in Syria started, by Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer winning journalist who wrote in the New Yorker magazine, that crazy, kooky left-wing rag, the New Yorker magazine, an article called The Redirection. And in that article, he explains how, dating back to at least 2005, okay, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, again, as the title suggests, the redirection, began, instead of targeting Al-Qaeda after 9/11, right, in 2005 began partnering with Al-Qaeda and groups like ISIS, beginning in 2005, to undermine governments that the U.S. did not like in the Middle East and North Africa. Those include Syria, Libya, Somalia, Lebanon, and of course the big kahuna being Iran, which is the ultimate country they want to undermine. And again, why is this surprising? We need to go back to Jimmy Carter, when he and Zelensky in June of 1979 began funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which one of its leaders was a guy named Osama bin Laden, who would go on to create Al-Qaeda. None of this is surprising, right? So the U.S. on and off has supported these guys for decades, since I was a child, okay? And now we see the result of this in Syria, where they've actually taken over the country. And by the way, Jelani admits what he did when he was in Al-Qaeda. He was cutting people's heads off who Al-Qaeda viewed as infidels or apostates. He now says, well, that was just youthful indiscretion.
That was then. This
like
is now. These are wild and crazy guys.
Yeah. Some of us used to smoke as teenagers or drink. He cut people's heads off. But all is forgiven, apparently. And as you know, Wilmer, he had a $10 million bounty on his head from the United States at the time he became the new leader of Syria.
The CIA of all people.
Yes. And that bounty's since been removed. because now, again, he wears a suit, he's a good guy, and meanwhile, Syria has been destabilized, and I think you can expect a lot of the Middle East to be destabilized. Lebanon, which is next door, has been attacked by the HTS group at the borders of Lebanon and Syria. And I think you're going to see more of that. One of the HTS guys even said, he bragged that HTS could take over, he could be in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. I believe he said within 2 hours, that they could take that over. So this is not a good situation. But this is where we find ourselves, Wilmer.
So Chow Yun writes that Syria. Oh, he says Syrians are now. I'm trying to find the exact quote. He says Syrians are now happy, and I remember talking to you a couple of weeks ago, as it was being reported that all of these Syrians were flocking back into the country, and you were calling me from the Syrian-Lebanon border, and you made the very clear point that what's not being discussed is all the people that are fleeing the country.
Right.
So as Chow Yun says, and by the way, Chow Yun, you need to understand sarcasm. You need to be tuned to sarcasm, particularly when you listen to me. But anyway, so are Syrians now celebrating? Are we going to be celebrating December 8th as Syrian Liberation Day, or is it more complex than that?
Look, there was some celebration when HTS took over. There's no doubt about that. There was some hope for improvement in the country, particularly because of these terrible sanctions that Trump had initiated, called the Caesar sanctions, which completely crippled the country. And people were excited that, there could be a better government, that, again, sanctions could end, Syria's economy could bounce back, reconstruction could happen from the war, which these sanctions were intended to prevent, and they did prevent. And, of course, there were some, particularly amongst the Sunnis, who were excited that this group took over, right, because they shared the ideology of HTS. But of course, for Christians and Alawites and Druze and Shia, they were immediately put in a state of fear. And again, many of them left. And while HTS has bragged that 200,000 people have returned to Syria since HTS took over, again, the UN reports 600,000 people have left. So that, if my math is good, that's a net of 400,000 people leaving. And I also think even amongst the people who were excited upon the, changing government, a lot of that excitement has turned to trepidation, fear, uncertainty, because things have not improved economically for people. Many people are now out of work. Even people who are working are not getting paid. And you do have these massacres that are happening. I mean, there's no question about it that that's happening. Even the Syrian Human Rights Observatory, which is a pro-Western group out of London, is reporting on these massacres. So I think that right now people are feeling like it's not clear things are going to get better. And again, when Giuliani first took over, he said we will have elections in March of this year, 2025. Mm-hmm. Now he's saying it may not be for 4 years. So all of a sudden, the tune is changing. And let me tell you, and they fired all the police from the old government, which, by the way, was done in Iraq, too. They got rid of all the former Ba'ath Party people. And guess what that led to? Disaster.
A huge, huge, huge mistake.
A huge power vacuum. And so now they're populating all the police with these Al-Qaeda guys who, look like Al Qaeda, by the way. They're walking around the streets with machine guns and the fatigues and the Al Qaeda beards, and some of them have the face masks. Again, some people are fine with that. Okay. Mm-hmm. Some people have no problem with that. Again, but if you're a Christian, you're an Alawite, you're a Shia, you're scared to death. That is not a comforting sight for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the people who are policing Damascus right now. So I think as each day passes, I think people are becoming a lot more worried for the future of Syria. And again, particularly because everything else aside, Syria has now lost a lot of its territory to foreign countries.
Mm-hmm.
Israel's now taking 30 to 40% of the water resources, very rich resources in the part of Syria it's taken over. Again, it now has the highest ground in the Levant, Mount Hermon, which Israel's saying it's never going to give up. How can any patriotic Syrian be happy with that state of affairs, right? That it's now being cannibalized, the country, by the U.S., Israel, and Turkey. How could anyone say that's a good thing? And it's not a good thing for the Syrian people. And here's the interesting part that a lot of people pointed out. While Jelani's group HTS has the wherewithal to massacre Alawites in homes, they haven't made one move against the foreign invaders. They have not resisted that at all. Okay, what kind of government that claims to represent their people don't defend the homeland against foreign invaders? I'll tell you what kind of government. One that is bought and paid for by the governments that are invading. That's who. And that is a stark reality that no one can deny because it's happening. Israel right now is within 30 kilometers of the capital of Damascus. They could strike Damascus at any time. By the way, they have struck Damascus over the years, including right after HTS took power. Israel went ahead and destroyed pretty much all of Syria's military capability. So Syria is now left largely defenseless from foreign invaders. And again, HTS did nothing to protect any of that.
They don't have an army. They're left without an army, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, HTS itself has 30,000. They think about 30,000 troops, which is fairly small, to deal with a country of that size. Again, they got rid of the rest of the police. A lot of the Syrian army fled or kind of melted into the population. And by the way, the HTS, the other thing, remember, Wilmer, they always told you as a kid, they said, no, the first thing the communists do is they take away your guns, right? Remember that? Mm-hmm. By the way, that's not true. A lot, you look at Cuba, the first thing they did is give people guns, okay? Well,
Venezuela.
Right. In Syria, the HTS, the first thing they did is take away people's guns. They were going house to house to take away people's guns. They took guns away from the Palestinian liberation groups that were happily in Syria, that Assad let be in Syria and let operate in Syria. They totally disarmed those people. So, the only people left, for the most part, there's still obviously some people out there with guns, but for the most part, the only people left with guns are the HTS people. So again, they now monopolize the arms. They now monopolize the government. They monopolize the police. And they monopolize the political system. By the way, and much of the political, judicial infrastructure is not working. The courts aren't functioning yet. Most of the government is not functioning. Okay, so if people have disputes, contract disputes, whatever, if they're arrested and need to go to court to prove, to defend themselves, there's no courts that are operating, So, and it's not clear when that's going to happen. Here's the thing. HTS's goal because they shared the goal of the West, was to overthrow Assad, not necessarily to rule. And I'm not sure they know how to rule or have the will to rule.
Correct.
And so that's another problem. You know, these guys are terrorists, okay? They were good at what they did. They were great terrorists. They were really good at terrorizing people, very good at chopping people's heads off and raping people, etc. They're not people who necessarily know how to run a country. So, and by the way, how would you feel? I mean, if you know, again, these known head choppers and rapists now held the highest positions in your government. I mean, how is that comforting to people?
I'm this viewer Chow Yun makes a number of comments. I'm wondering if Chow Yun is a troll, but makes good contradictory statements which will help diffuse the lies. Syria was never a democracy. I remember interviewing you from Syria. You were in Syria as an election observer. And I believe the outcome of that election, which was about 6 years ago, it seems, 5 years ago, al-Assad won about 86% of the vote. And I remember interviewing you on the ground in Syria, and you sounded a lot like Jimmy Carter about the free and fair election in Syria.
Well, certainly what I thought at the time, and I think now, is that his victory represented the will of the people. Now, was it the best election? Did every sector were they able to run? I don't know. Let's just assume it wasn't the best election. It wasn't necessarily one that allowed every potential party. But the fact is, at that time, which was 2021, people were happy to have Assad because he had defeated these terrorist groups. And most people, even if they didn't like Assad, they thought he was the better. He was the better alternative. He was the lesser of the evils.
Sounds like the United States and Donald Trump.
In some ways. And I'll tell you, I talked to a cleric. By the way, I can't give his name or his position or his church.
Okay.
Because he's afraid of recriminations from the government, which tells you a lot right there.
Mm-hmm.
But this cleric told me, I think the best, has the best quote. He was not an Assad fan. What he said is, we lived under a dictatorship. He says, now we live under something worse. A government run by these religious extremists, right?
And this is a cleric.
Yeah, this is a Christian cleric. Very smart guy. And the other thing he said is HTS, the U.S. brought HTS here, they can take them. Okay, so he understood the dynamics of all this.
Mm-hmm.
And the point is, look, for all of Assad's faults, especially if you go back to 2010, okay, before the war was brought to Syria, and it was brought to it. It was brought from the outside in by the United States and other parties, a lot of other parties, and I'll get to that. Syria was a very prosperous place, economically, socially, very peaceful place. In fact, I'll give you a little anecdote. My friend Roger Harris, who's a bird biologist, he used to work with the State Department in helping them with international tours that they did with like burgeoning leaders. And the two guys he worked at the U.S. State Department said 20 years ago, Syria was the favorite country of all of their people to visit because it was so peaceful and all this great historical antiquity, etc. And again, in 2010, it was actually a high watermark for Syria. They were doing great economically. They had 8.5 million visitors. And actually, Assad was beginning to open up the country. He was beginning to try to actually have a more pluralistic, free country. Because, he and his dad did rule the countries as virtual dictators. But what happens a lot is the West used that opening, which they do so often, to begin this war against Syria, this brutal war. When I was in Syria in 2021, I was told that the government forces of Syria had gathered passports amongst the fighters against the government from 84 different countries. 84 different countries were represented amongst the opposition fighters, okay? This was a world war against Syria. And it's amazing that Syria had survived it, that Assad survived it. And again, I think a lot of people in the end gave him a lot of credit for that. But in the end, he survived it only until the end of last year. He between the war, between these sanctions, between the U.S. occupation, the army and the government were crippled and brought down, and couldn't put up a lot of resistance to HTS, which is what happened. But what Syria could have been, looking at it in 2010, had that war never happened, we'll never know. But I think it was the one country in the West Asia that could have had a secular, pluralistic country, possibly with some more burgeoning democratic, norms. But again, we'll never know that. And of course, Noam Chomsky often points out, when governments are fighting a brutal counter revolution, if that's what you want to call it.
That's going to be my next question to you. Please, go ahead. You're reading my mind. Go ahead.
That is going to exacerbate the worst tendencies of that government. No government becomes more democratic and more free when they're fighting these terrorists from 84 different countries.
Let me put it this way. Let me put it this way, because I'm teaching American government and I'm also teaching international human rights, trying to follow in your footsteps. And we're at very early stages of the course where we're talking about different types of government, authoritarian, non-authoritarian, and China is listed as authoritarian. Russia is listed as authoritarian. Venezuela is listed as authoritarian. And one of the things that I've said to my kids is, you have to understand what authoritarian means and why the authoritarian is such. And I said to them yesterday, if you're under attack by the United States, you got to lock stuff down and handle some business, because the objective is to throw you out. And you have to protect your country. You have to protect your interests. And what's more authoritarian than Joe Biden trying to implement a information oversight group that scrubs social media and deplatforms people for trying to tell a contrary narrative than the United States? That's what you call authoritarianism.
Right.
Dan Kovalik.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I always give this example. If NPR, for example, because I don't listen to NPR anymore. I can't stand it, but I listened to it for a long time.
Right.
3 years.
Right.
Including during the Syria war. If Syria covered the U.S. Civil War, okay, like they covered the Syria war, and if NPR was sympathetic to the South, for example, here's how they'd cover the Civil War, U.S. Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, this brutal leader, has sent General Sherman, his henchman, to the South. He has burned whole swaths of the South, killing mostly civilians, preventing them from growing food, starving them out. And this shows the true nature of the Abraham Lincoln regime, right? Because what I said did happen, okay? Right. The burning down of the South, right? By General Sherman. And you know how that's justified, by the way? I saw, in history books, they say, well, the Union troops were frustrated after 3 years of civil war. The civil war in Syria lasted from 2011 to 2020. Right? How exhausted were they? I mean, we do not judge others the way we judge ourselves.
Of course not.
Right?
Wait a minute. And to your point about that counter narrative, there is a group in this country called the Lost Cause. And they describe the war. Their narrative is basically 180 degrees different than reality. In fact, George Bush's secretary, attorney general, what's the guy's name? It'll come to me in a minute.
Not Gonzalez.
No, before him.
Okay.
Before him, in the first term, right when 9/11 occurred, the secretary, the attorney general, he was a full-fledged member of the Lost Cause. In fact, I got a book up here. Anyway, so what you're describing, there are people that actually today still hold those positions.
Yeah,
is my point.
Yeah, and so the point is, though, what Abraham Lincoln did to win the war doesn't show the true nature of what he was about or what his opposition was about. And of course, in the end, he rid the country of slavery, which was a good. And again, to Assad's credit, he had defeated, at least temporarily, these terrible terrorists that were trying to take over, who have now taken over. So
John Ashcroft,
of course, terrible John Ashcroft, who I think defended torture and all sorts of things.
He subscribed hook, line, and sinker to the Lost Cause ideology.
Yeah. So, I can say with complete, certainty and with my conscience clear that what is in government now is much worse than what came before. The one thing Assad did is he did protect the different ethnic religious groups.
Now see that, Dan, because Chow Yun says he tortured and murdered people, but that's old news.
Look, I am certain that under his government, people were tortured and murdered. There's no doubt, and I'm not defending that.
Right. Okay.
Okay. And again, though a lot of that was in the context of a brutal civil war against terrorists that came into the country through tunnels, were raping people, were cutting people's heads off.
Okay.
As Giuliani himself admitted he did. Trying to start a caliphate, which our own U.S. Department Defense Intelligence Agency said in a 2012 declassified document was the goal of these groups that the West was supporting. Yes, a lot of, there were crimes committed in trying to fight those people, as they would be if that happened in the United States. I'm not defending them, but it does explain why things got as bad as they did. And the truth is, the Christian community was saved under Assad, the Alawite community, the Shia community. They would have been wiped out because that's what those groups were trying to do. And they destroyed ancient antiquities and buildings, like in Palmyra. You remember the famous guy who was the curator of this museum of ancient antiquities in Palmyra. He died trying to save it from the terrorists. These were nihilistic, terroristic groups that Assad was fighting against. And I'll just say, to expect that he was going to do that, in a fashion that honored, all the values we support, is just ridiculous. It's never going to happen. It didn't happen in the U.S. Civil War. It didn't happen in the U.S. War on Terror. Do you ever heard of something called Guantanamo?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. I mean, which now we're trying to expand to put immigrants in. That's a whole nother story.
I've been to Gitmo.
Yeah, but it just doesn't tell the whole story of what was happening in that country. And again, at the time in 2010, Assad, who, by the way, was an ophthalmologist, he never wanted to be a leader. It was his brother that was supposed to succeed the dad, but the brother was killed. And Assad was living in Great Britain at the time with his wife, beautiful wife, by the way, and was an ophthalmologist. And he was a very reluctant leader. And in 2010, he was actually loosening the reins of the intelligence state, trying to open up the country. And that's when the mayhem broke out. And by the way, a lot of people ended up being mad at him for doing that, for loosening the reins of the intelligence state, because it allowed these crazy terrorists to come in and do what they did. And these are the decisions that are made by leaders in countries like Syria who are targeted by Western regime change operations.
Kevin Baptiste, thank you very much. Homeboy, thank you very much for that $10 super sticker. Greatly appreciate it. You know, you talked about, there was discussion a little earlier about people returning to the country. And I think it's also important when you talk about people returning to the country, it's important to understand from whence they've come and why they've come back. Many of them fled to Germany. Many of them fled to countries all over Europe and were not welcomed at all, and found themselves in camps, found themselves living in very dire circumstances. So when they see an opportunity to go back home, they will seize that opportunity. It's not, my point in that is, it's too simplistic to ascribe glee and pleasure that Assad is gone with people returning to the country. There are many that see it that way, but there are also many that don't.
And again, the numbers are that 200,000 people have returned and 600,000 people have left. So more people have left than have come back. But yeah, I mean, Lebanon itself, which is a tiny country, I think it has 10 million people, they took in 1.5 million Syrian refugees. They had no idea what to do with those people. You know, a lot of those people were living on the streets. And by the way, they tended to be very reviled by the Lebanese population, who looked down on them, who saw them as, you know, being a strain on the economy and social structure of Lebanon. And even to this day, you can see Syrian shanty towns along the border. They actually, most of them are in what appear to be like junkyards, like Arlo junkyards, and these shanty towns are there. And those people have ping-ponged back and forth between Syria and Lebanon, depending on which country was worse off at any given time, right? And of course, Syria itself, when we have to talk about this, Syria itself took in 1 million Iraqi refugees after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. 1 million. And that helped destabilize the country. You know, people don't realize what chaos the West has inflicted on these countries with war, destabilization efforts. It's been a disaster, a societal disaster for every one of these countries.
It always creates a power vacuum. And we know nature deplores a vacuum. And we did it in Iran. We did it in Iran, but the real vacuum we did in Iraq.
Right.
We did it in Libya.
Yes.
We've seen this movie so many times. And people still don't seem to understand it always turns out the same way. You mentioned Israel has taken the water from Syria. People need to understand, because this doesn't get a lot of discussion. When you look at what's happening in the West Bank, when a lot of the conflict is over water.
Yes.
Israel has taken water from Syria. And while Netanyahu was getting on his plane on Sunday to come to the United States, one of the things he talked about was, we're going to redraw the map of the region. And so now when you see what Israel is doing in Syria, they're redrawing the map.
Yes, well, and again, people, when people say that Israel, some leaders in Israel wanted to create greater Israel, they were criticized as conspiracy theorists, as anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists. But now we see greater Israel actually being created. Israel has now taken over a huge swath of southern Lebanon, okay? And they want to take over parts of Lebanon as part of greater Israel. They want to take over parts of Syria as greater Israel. And now they've taken parts of southern Syria. This is happening now. And they now threaten Jordan. They're now threatening Egypt. Again, all this they want, there's all areas in these countries they want as greater Israel. And that's what Netanyahu wants to create. And of course, they have no right to do that. These are sovereign countries with sovereign borders. But that's exactly what Israel's doing. And as you said, water is the big resource that Israel has stolen from the West Bank. They were stealing it from Gaza too, by the way. There were pipes that ran through Gaza into, Israel proper, however you want to put it. The settlers were able to get to that water first, the way the pipes were constructed. And now, however, 85% of the water wells in Gaza have just been destroyed. Okay, and Israel did that; they destroyed that. So now there's basically no water at all there, which is part of the genocidal campaign to starve out the Palestinian people there. But yes, they're very adept at stealing land, stealing homes, and again, building this greater Israel project, which, the U.S. appears, at least at the moment, to support.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll learn a lot more after tonight, because Netanyahu is meeting with Trump tonight to talk about those plans, to talk about, it's clear he may want to restart the war in Gaza. We'll see what comes out of all that. But it's this is a crucial period in the history of the region, for sure.
They're staying in Syria for another minute. Reuters has a piece entitled "Syria's Shara to discuss defense pact with Turkey's Erdogan." Syria's transitional president, they call him al-Shara, and Turkish President Erdogan are expected to discuss a joint defense pact in Ankara. In fact, they were supposed to have that conversation today, including establishing Turkish air bases in central Syria and training Syria's army. Talk about that. You mentioned some of this a little earlier, but one of the things that comes to mind in all of this is not only Turkey talking to the Syrians, but what now happens to the Kurds, and Russia is also still supposed to be talking with this new Damascus so-called administration about the fate of its two bases in Syria, one in Tartus and one in Latakia.
Latakia, which I've been to before, by the way, Latakia.
Okay.
Yes. So, first of all, Turkey's been one of the prime movers in the attempt to unseat Assad. They basically controlled the Idlib region in the northwest of Syria, where these terrorists were staying. And so in 2020, essentially there was an uneasy ceasefire agreed to between the Assad government and these terrorist groups who were allowed to go back into Idlib and operate and basically control with the help of Turkey. Okay. And I always point, I think it's always important to point out, they always say how bloodthirsty Assad was, but a lot of governments wouldn't have tolerated that, right? If we had, multiple terrorist groups trying to overthrow the U.S. government, I doubt if they'd give them a whole state to operate in.
They haven't given the Proud Boys a state.
Yeah, exactly. So think about that for a minute. But in any case, Turkey was a very important protector of those groups in Idlib, which borders Turkey. Turkey will clearly be a big player in Syria. And in fact, Turkey, by the way, Erdogan himself believes that Turkey has a right to parts of Syria, including the city of Aleppo. He said that had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and he sees himself as,
the new Ottoman.
Yes. And he wants to take Aleppo, and Turkey right now has some control over Aleppo. So Turkey will be there to stay. Again, Israel will be there to stay. And the U.S. will probably be there to stay. So, Syria is being carved up, again, by all these countries. Yeah, we'll see if Russia is able to keep a base there. In terms of the Kurds, of course, Erdogan has, real antipathy towards the Kurds, because there's also Turkish Kurds that he's been at odds with. And he's not going to tolerate the Kurds in Syria for very long. So we'll see. And HTS has said they're not going to either. They may go to war with the Kurds again. So anyone who thought that, the West is going to take care of the Kurds if Assad is overthrown, that ain't going to happen.
Didn't former President George H.W. Bush originally tell the Kurds in Iraq, go ahead and attack Saddam, we'll protect you? And then he basically convinced them to go into their own slaughter.
Yes, he did do that. He said, rise up against Saddam, we'll back you. That's exactly true. And then in the end, the U.S. and Germany provided the gas that Saddam Hussein used to gas his own Kurdish population.
And that's how we knew. That's how we knew that Saddam had gas, because we had the receipts, because we sold him the gas.
Yes, of course. We gave it to him also to attack Iran with chemical weapons. Yeah, had there been weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2002 and 2003, which there weren't because they had been gotten rid of by then, they would have been ours, right? And of course, that was always the case. That's what always made the whole thing ridiculous from the get-go. But that is the reality. So the Kurds have always been a pawn in the game of the West. In Turkey, for example, Noam Chomsky points out that under the Clinton administration, I believe that it was the first term of the Clinton administration, maybe the second. Anyway, Turkey ended up killing, I believe, 300,000 Kurds within its country. And at that time, Turkey was the third largest recipient of U.S. military aid in the world. So Clinton actually supported Turkey in massacring its own Kurds. So again,
in violation of American law.
Yes. And so again, the Kurds have always been this ally when the U.S. wanted them to be an ally, but they were expendable whenever the U.S. decided that they could be discarded. And I'm sadly, you're going to probably see that in Syria.
And folks, this is why the show is called Connecting the Dots. And this is why I have brilliant individuals such as Professor Dan Kovalik on the show to help us to connect the dots, because contrary to what a lot of you, contrary to what some of you want to chirp about off on the side here, just basically reciting the American narrative and talking points. No, this isn't right, never was right, and will never be right. There's nothing good to see here. I want to shift gears with you for a minute on this whole issue with USAID and Lil Marco Rubio now claiming to be the interim director of USAID. And one of the things that has intrigued me about how this story is unfolding is nobody in the mainstream wants to talk about the real purpose of USAID, which is a cover for the CIA for regime change, along with the National Endowment for Democracy.
Correct.
USAID goes into countries under the pretext or pretense of providing food and international support, which it does. But one of the alternative purposes is regime change, is to undermine the government of the countries, many of the countries it goes into. And here's an example: Venezuela. That whole story about the convoy of relief trucks that were attacked by Maduro, that never happened. It wasn't Maduro that attacked those trucks in Venezuela. Dan Kovalik.
Yeah, no, and by the way, those relief trucks, apparently at least one of them was filled with weapons and not aid. But yeah, what happened is, so most people know the CIA has been involved in regime change and coups since its inception in 1948. But what happened was in the early 1970s, Senator Frank Church held these, what are known as the Church Committee hearings, because he was upset about the things the CIA was doing, assassinating world leaders, again, overthrowing governments. And so there are these hearings that exposed a lot of the CIA's misdeeds and crimes. And after that, it was decided by the U.S. government, particularly under Ronald Reagan, that they needed to contract out some of the regime change work away from the CIA to some other agencies to kind of take the heat off the CIA and off the regime change operations. That is, they'd be even more covert now if they were operated by USAID, which is ostensibly an aid organization, or the National Endowment for Democracy. And that's exactly what happened. So the NED and the USAID, they began doing a lot of the work that the CIA had done over the years, which was supporting opposition political parties in other countries, including and groups that would go on to violently try to overthrow governments, like in Nicaragua in 2018. The National Endowment for Democracy and USAID had given millions of dollars to groups that participated in a very violent coup attempt in 2018 in Nicaragua. They were actually also a conduit of aid for some of these terrorist groups in Syria. And so, as you say, while they had this kind of veneer of being these benign aid groups, they really were a branch of the CIA, really. And I fear now that some people on the left are excited. Oh, USAID or AID is going away. In fact, their website's down now if you try to go to it. But they're just going to be brought under the State Department, meaning they're just going to be, it's going to kind of just be more overt, right? Because the State Department was the one calling the policies anyway that USAID would carry out, right? And now it'll just be more direct. They don't have to even change buildings to find out what their orders are in terms of, regime change operations. So I'm not sure if this is a big change, but we'll have to see. But again, maybe it's more honest in a way. They will be openly what they had been kind of secretly for a long time.
And to that point, Kevin Baptiste asked, do either of you think now USAID will be placed under the State Department? To your point, Dan, over the years, there had been a lot of discussion about what to do with USAID. I mean, this has been an ongoing conversation for a number of years because that organization does a number of things. Some of the things that it does are under the purview of the State Department. Some of the things that it does are under the purview or within the interests of other departments. And so they did chop up USAID to a certain degree, but there was an element of it that all parties agreed needed to remain independent. And the element of it that needed to remain independent was the element of it is it's regime change corridor, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, so we'll see what happens now. Again, I think it'll just be folded into one or more existing departments, and it will continue to function the way it is functioned. Unfortunately, that's my prediction.
Now here's a question for you which is just my opinion, and I'd like to get your thought on this. About 10 days ago or so, Donald Trump said that he was going to release the unredacted files on the King assassination, the John Kennedy assassination, and I think the Robert Kennedy assassination as well.
Yes.
And I posited at that point that he's so angry at the Justice Department and he's so angry at the deep state that he wants to embarrass them. Could it be, based upon understanding of the machinations of USAID, is also part of this same mindset, that he wants to deconstruct USAID because of their basically a front group for the CIA? Or is that a stretch?
No, I think so. I mean, I think he didn't like some things about the USAID because it did have kind of a woke thing going on. It promoted a lot of LGBT policies and groups abroad. He didn't like that. So again, it's not that he opposed the regime change stuff. He just didn't like some of the other aspects of it.
Okay.
You know? So now I think, again, he's going to kind of retool it. But yeah, I mean, and no, what you're also saying, you know, about releasing the Kennedy documents and King documents, which is good. I mean, I think it's all great. As you say, there's a certain spitefulness motivating him to do it, but I think it's great that it's being done. And by the way, I think it's going to turn out, I think we all know how this ends. I think it's going to turn out the U.S. government or parts of it were behind the Kennedy assassinations, the King assassinations. And what does that say about U.S. democracy? That literally our governments were couped, right? JFK was couped. His brother was stopped from being president. King, one of our great, social leaders, was murdered. I mean, this looks like a banana republic stuff,
What's more authoritarian than assassination?
Yeah. We talk about Assad and we have nothing to talk about. Let's start looking inwards in what our government is and what it does to undermine democracy in this country,
So you've just come back from Syria. And again, it's very important for people to understand that you were in country as well as Lebanon. What are the three major things that that you want people to take away from this? And again, I strongly suggest, you suggested that people read the 2007 New York Times piece,
New York,
the redirect,
New Yorker magazine. Yeah.
New Yorker. What did I say?
New York Times.
Oh, New Yorker magazine by Cy Hirsch, the redirect and redirection.
Yeah.
Thank you. I also strongly suggest that people pull up the Wall Street Journal piece on al-Jilani. How does a terrorist? Let me see if I can quickly find the actual headline. Here we go. How a Syrian rebel went from an American jail to seizing Aleppo. How a Syrian rebel went from an American jail to seizing Aleppo. And what's important here is that's in the Wall Street Journal, which is no longer as Archie Bunker would say, a left-wing pinko commie rag. And so to those who are saying that all I'm doing here is spewing, what did this guy say? All I'm doing is spewing foolishness and disinformation. Well, read this piece in the Wall Street Journal, how a Syrian rebel, because one of the first things they say at the very top is this guy is taken off of the battlefield, put in an American prison in Iraq, in Iraq,
yes.
And then 2 years later winds up on the battlefield, back on the battlefield with bags of cash. That's the Wall Street Journal, folks.
Yeah, he was an asset. He was a CIA asset, is what he was.
So again, to those of you who just want to talk about me spewing rhetoric and disinformation and misinformation, I think you all need to read that. We're not making this stuff up. So again, you've just returned. What are the three really significant things that you want folks to understand about these developments?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want people to realize that, Lebanon and Syria are these historic, beautiful countries, ancient countries, which, are part of our history, a part of our collective history.
Civilization.
Yeah. They are the cradle of civilization, of Christianity, early Christianity, Islam, culture. They house many Roman sites and antiquities. They have streets, where Jesus walked, in St. Paul and St. Peter.
The road to Damascus. I've read about that in some biblical texts.
Exactly. And they have been greatly damaged, and a lot of those antiquities greatly destroyed. Things, again, that are part of our collective history. And it makes me very sad. These are places that should be paradises, okay?
Mm-hmm.
They're beautiful, and the people are beautiful. They have many religions, many cultures, many ethnicities. And the West has come in and set these groups against each other. These are people who've lived for centuries together in peace. And the West, trying to gain a foothold in West Asia because of the oil, for the most part, have pitted these groups against each other, have incited violence in these countries, have devastated whole parts of these countries. And it has to end. The West needs to stop. The U.S. needs to stop trying to control other countries, stop trying to overthrow other governments, stop going to war in these countries. Let these countries solve their own problems. And otherwise, they won't exist. And that would be a tragedy. Beirut, for example, if you tell people you're going to Beirut now, they think you're nuts. Beirut used to be known as the Paris of the East. It's on the Mediterranean. It's still a beautiful city, but of course, you
take your life in your hands if you try to go.
Yeah, but the West has done so much to undermine that place. And it breaks my heart. I mean, when you go there, it breaks your heart. And even I was with, a Lebanese woman, and we had lunch on the Mediterranean, which was great. And as we were walking out, we both just looked at each other. We both said, we just feel so sad. Like, this should be heaven on earth, and it really is. We have to understand our government has done a lot to undermine the peace there.
To your point, the last time that I was in Iran, they were part of the trip. They were supposed to take us to Beirut as part of the trip to Iran, and they told us we can't go. We can't guarantee your safety. We can't take you. And they told us that because I was there 10 days on that trip. I think I was there 10 days, and they had been trying the entire time to find a space, to find a way to get us in. And they said, we can't take you because we can't guarantee your safety.
Yeah. No. And again, it has been a place, in different times, it has been very unsafe and has been reduced to civil war or been, bombarded by Israel in particular. A lot's been lost, though there's still a lot to save. And we need to end these wars. I mean, we need to take care of our own problems in this country and not meddle in other people's business. That's my big takeaway.
Cherie says many Buddhist temples have been destroyed. Are you aware of that?
In those countries, I'm not aware of that. I know in Afghanistan, very famously, that happened.
Okay.
And that was highly critical. Everyone was clutching their pearls when that happened. And that was terrible when the Taliban did that. But no, very few people know that the shrine of St. Simon Peter in South Lebanon was destroyed by Israel, for example. Or many ancient churches have been destroyed by Israel recently. I don't know about the Buddhist temples in Syria or Lebanon.
We finally found something you don't know about.
There you go. Hey, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
Professor Dan Kovalik, my dear, dear friend, thank you so much. Greatly, greatly appreciate that. And as always, Dan, look forward to having you back.
Thanks, Wilmer. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episodes every day. In fact, tomorrow, we have scheduled with us tomorrow. We're going to be talking about all of this discussion about immigration with Maru Mora Villapando. She's going to join us. Follow on social media. You can find all the links below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter. And we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you all again tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.